Decision Points by George W. Bush. Introduction. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. Imagine you're sitting in a second-grade classroom. The air smells of chalk dust and Elmer's glue. The children are reading a story about a pet goat, their small voices a soft murmur. You're the President of the United States, there to talk about education. It's a normal Tuesday. And then, your Chief of Staff leans in and whispers those 9 words into your ear. In that single, heart-stopping moment, your world, and the world itself, tilts on its axis. The reading lesson continues, but you are a million miles away. Your mind is racing. Who did this? How many are dead? What do I do now? The cameras in the back of the room are all pointed at you. The children are looking at you. The world is waiting. What do you do? This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This was the reality for George W. Bush on the morning of September 11, 2001. That moment, and the thousands of moments that followed, are the heart of his memoir, Decision Points. This isn't your typical presidential autobiography, filled with long policy discussions or a day-by-day account of life in the White House. Bush chose a different path. He structured his story around the 14 most consequential decisions of his life and presidency. From the intensely personal choice to quit drinking, to the world-altering decision to go to war in Iraq, he takes us inside the room where it happened. The book sold millions of copies, not just because people were curious about the man, but because it offers something few ever can, a direct look into the mind of a leader at the crossroads of history. It's a journey into the immense weight, the crushing pressure, and the profound loneliness of making choices that will affect millions of lives. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through those pivotal moments. We'll explore how a man who once described himself as a restless spirit, searching for his own identity, found himself at the center of a new and frightening world. You'll learn the framework he used to make impossible choices, how he wrestled with the consequences of getting it right and getting it wrong, and why he believes that, in the end, leadership isn't about popularity, it's about having the courage to decide. By the time we're done, you'll not only understand the presidency in a new way, but you'll also have a powerful lens through which to view the decisions, big and small, that will shape your own life. Because as you'll soon discover, life isn't defined by the positions we hold, but by the choices we make. Book summary. To understand the president, you first have to understand the man. And to understand George W. Bush, you have to go back to a simple question his wife Laura asked him one evening, her voice calm and steady. Can you remember the last day you didn't have a drink? He tried. He really did. He thought back over the week. A few beers on Monday. A band B, his favorite, Benedictine and brandy, on Tuesday. Bourbon on Wednesday. Beer again on Thursday and Friday. And Saturday. Well, Saturday was a blur of martinis, more beer, and another band B. He couldn't remember a single day. Not one. Drinking, he realized, had become more than a habit. It was becoming his god. It was a form of selfishness, putting himself ahead of his family, especially his wife and their young twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna. This wasn't the man he wanted to be. He'd been raised by 2 extraordinary people, George and Barbara Bush. His father was a hero, the youngest pilot in the Navy in World War II, shot down over the Pacific, a man who built a life on courage, service, and integrity. His mother was the family's anchor, a woman of sharp wit and unconditional love. They had set a high bar, not through pressure, but through example. They never told him he had to be president, they just loved him and encouraged him to find his own way. For a long time, his way was a restless one. He followed his father's path to Andover and Yale, but he was more interested in being the commissioner of a stickball league and playing rugby than he was in campus politics. After college, While the Vietnam War raged, he chose to serve as a pilot in the Texas Air National Guard. He loved flying, the feeling of power and control as his F-102 fighter jet rocketed down the runway. But after his service, he drifted. He worked on an oil rig, sold sporting goods, and eventually found his way back to the oil fields of West Texas. Life was a series of adventures without an anchor. He was searching, but he wasn't sure for what. Then came the turning point. In 1986, the year he turned 40, he woke up after a raucous birthday celebration with a crushing hangover and a moment of stunning clarity. He saw two paths ahead. One was a path of continued drinking, of selfishness, of slowly drifting away from his family and his faith. The other was a path of change. On a morning jog, with his head pounding, he made up his mind. He was done drinking. He walked back into his hotel room and told Laura, "I will never have another drink." It was, he says, one of the toughest decisions he ever made. But without it, none of the others that followed would have been possible. Quitting drinking wasn't just about giving up alcohol. It was about choosing responsibility over indulgence. It was the first truly difficult decision he made, not for himself, but for the people he loved. It was the moment he began to forge the character that would one day be tested on the world stage. Soon after, another decision point arrived, one that would set him on a new trajectory. A year after he quit drinking, his friends Joe and Jan O'Neill invited him over for a backyard barbecue. They wanted him to meet Jan's friend, a quiet, intelligent school librarian named Laura Welsh. He arrived a little late and saw her in the backyard, wearing a blue sundress. For him, it was love at first sight. They grew up in the same town, even attended the same junior high, but their paths had never crossed. He was restless and talkative. She was calm and a listener. They were a perfect match. 3 months later, they were married. Marrying Laura wasn't just a personal joy, it was the decision that finally gave him an anchor. It grounded him. It gave him a partner who would be his steady hand through every storm to come. With a new sense of purpose, he stepped into the political arena for the first time on his own terms. In 1978, he ran for Congress in West Texas. He was young, energetic, and had a famous last name. His opponent, a folksy state senator named Kent Hance, used it all against him. Hance painted Bush as an outsider, an Ivy League carpetbagger who didn't understand West Texas. In one ad, Hance pointed out that while he was graduating from Texas Tech, his opponent was at Yale. "We don't need someone from the Northeast telling us what our problems are," the ad concluded. Bush lost. It stung. But it taught him an invaluable lesson, one that would serve him for the rest of his career. If you let your opponent define you, you will lose. He stepped back from the front lines of politics but stayed close to the fire. He moved to Washington to help run his father's successful 1988 presidential campaign. He was his father's loyal son, the enforcer, the one who made sure the campaign staff put his dad first. He learned about the inner workings of a national campaign, the immense pressure, and the brutal scrutiny of the media. And he learned how much it hurt to watch someone you love get attacked. When a magazine cover infamously labeled his war hero father a wimp, he was furious. It hardened his view of the press and deepened his protective instincts. After his father won the presidency, Bush returned to Texas. He wasn't interested in being a Washington insider. He wanted to make his own way. Along with a group of partners, he bought the Texas Rangers baseball team. For him, it was a dream come true. He loved the game, the strategy, the competition. As the team's managing general partner, he wasn't just a fan, he was the public face of the franchise. He gave speeches across the state, dealt with tough questions from sports reporters, and learned how to connect with a crowd. It was here, in the world of baseball, that he honed the communication skills that would one day make him a two-term governor and a two-term president. But the political world was never far away. He watched his father's presidency navigate the end of the Cold War and victory in the Gulf War. He also saw him lose his re-election campaign in 1992. Watching a good man lose, he writes, was one of the worst experiences of his life. But it also brought an unexpected sense of liberation. With his father out of office, he was finally free to run on his own, without his decisions reflecting on a sitting president. The itch returned. In 1994, he decided to run for governor of Texas. His opponent was Ann Richards, a popular, sharp-tongued incumbent who seemed unbeatable. Everyone, including his own mother, told him he couldn't win. This time, he wouldn't let his opponent define him. He ran a disciplined campaign focused on 4 key issues: education reform, welfare reform, juvenile justice, and legal reform. He refused to get drawn into a war of insults with Governor Richards. On election night, he pulled off a stunning upset. As governor, he proved to be a different kind of Republican. He worked with Democrats, including the powerful Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, a legendary and crusty figure in Texas politics. Together, they passed all 4 of his major reform initiatives in a single legislative session. He learned the art of bipartisan leadership, of finding common ground without sacrificing principle. He was re-elected in 1998 with nearly 70% of the vote, becoming the first Texas governor to win consecutive 4-year terms. The stage was set for his biggest decision yet. As the 2000 election approached, the calls for him to run for president grew louder. He worried about the impact on his family, especially his teenage daughters. He had seen what the spotlight did to a political family. He knew the pain of hearing your dad called nasty names on television. Did he have the right to put his own family through that? In the end, he felt a calling. He had a clear vision for the country, a philosophy he called compassionate conservatism. He wanted to cut taxes, raise standards in schools, and rally the power of faith-based charities. After months of soul-searching, he decided to run. The 2000 election was a political roller coaster, culminating in one of the most bizarre and contested election nights in American history. That night, the networks first called Florida for his opponent, Al Gore, essentially declaring the election over. Bush was preparing to concede. Then, his strategist Karl Rove burst in, insisting the numbers were wrong. The networks retracted their call. Hours later, they called the race for Bush. Al Gore called to concede. But as Bush prepared to give his victory speech, Gore called back and retracted his concession. The margin in Florida was razor-thin. What followed were 36 days of recounts, legal battles, and hanging chads. The fate of the presidency rested on a few hundred votes in a single state. The fight went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ultimately ended the recounts, making George W. Bush the 43rd President of the United States. He entered office under a cloud of controversy, with half the country feeling he had been illegitimately elected. His first major test came not in politics, but in science and ethics. The issue was embryonic stem cell research. Scientists believed that stem cells, which could transform into any type of cell in the body, held the promise of curing diseases from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's. But there was a profound moral catch: the only way to get these cells was to destroy a human embryo. The country was deeply divided. On one side were people like Nancy Reagan, who wrote him a heartbreaking letter urging him to fund the research in hopes of finding a cure for her husband. On the other were those who believed that an embryo was a human life, and that destroying it, even for a noble cause, crossed a fundamental moral line. Bush was torn. He believed in the promise of science, but he also believed in the sanctity of life. He launched an exhaustive review, meeting with scientists, ethicists, religious leaders, and patient advocates. He studied the issue for months. He didn't want to make a decision based on polls or political pressure. He wanted to find a principled solution. In August 2001, he addressed the nation in his first primetime Oval Office speech. He announced a compromise. The federal government would, for the first time ever, fund research on existing stem cell lines, those where the embryo had already been destroyed. But he drew a moral line. Taxpayer money would not be used to encourage any further destruction of human embryos. It was a decision that pleased almost no one completely, but it was an attempt to navigate one of the most complex ethical dilemmas of our time. It was a classic Bush decision: find a principled middle ground and stick to it, regardless of the political heat. He thought this might be the most difficult decision of his presidency. He had no idea what was coming. Less than a month later, on a clear Tuesday morning, he was in that second-grade classroom in Florida. Chief of Staff Andy Card leaned in and whispered those 9 words. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. Bush describes the moments that followed with chilling clarity. His first reaction was rage. Then, he looked at the innocent faces of the children and knew he had to project calm. He finished the reading lesson, left the classroom, and stepped into a world transformed. In a holding room, he watched the television footage of the second plane hitting the South Tower. The fireball. The smoke. He scribbled a brief statement and spoke to the nation, promising that terrorism against our nation will not stand. The Secret Service rushed him to Air Force One. As the plane climbed steeply into the sky, he learned a third plane had hit the Pentagon. His blood was boiling. He recalls, the first plane could have been an accident. The second was definitely an attack. The third was a declaration of war. Aboard Air Force One, he was largely cut off from the world. The communications were poor, the TV feed sporadic. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness. He was the most powerful man on earth, yet he couldn't stop people from jumping from the burning towers he was seeing in fleeting, horrifying images. He made his first decision as a wartime commander-in-chief. With reports of more hijacked planes in the air, he gave the order to the Air Force pilots patrolling the skies over Washington. If a commercial airliner was unresponsive and appeared to be a threat, they had the authority to shoot it down. It was an agonizing order, one he prayed no pilot would have to execute. He wanted to return to Washington immediately, to lead from the Oval Office. But the Secret Service, and Vice President Dick Cheney from the secure bunker beneath the White House, insisted it was too dangerous. There were credible threats against Air Force One itself. Reluctantly, he diverted to an Air Force base in Louisiana, and then to another in Nebraska. He hated the image of being on the run, but he understood his responsibility to ensure the continuity of government. From a command center in Nebraska, he held a video conference with his national security team. Who did this? He asked CIA Director George Tenet. The answer was swift: Al-Qaeda. That evening, he finally returned to a lockdown Washington. Smoke was still rising from the Pentagon. He went to the Oval Office and addressed a grieving and fearful nation. He spoke of the evil of the attacks, the heroism of the first responders, and the resilience of the American spirit. We will make no distinction, he declared, between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. It was a statement that would come to be known as the Bush Doctrine, and it would define the next 7 years of his presidency. The days that followed were a blur of grief and resolve. He met with families of the victims, stood on the rubble of the Pentagon, and traveled to New York City. The scene at Ground Zero was, he writes, like a nightmare. The air was thick with smoke and soot. The devastation was total. He stood atop a crumpled fire truck with a bullhorn, surrounded by exhausted firefighters and rescue workers. They were angry, grieving, and demanding action. "We can't hear you," someone shouted. "I can hear you," Bush shouted back. "The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The crowd erupted in a defiant chant, "USA! USA!" In that moment, he wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. He was their president, channeling their pain, their anger, and their resolve. He carried with him the police shield of an officer named George Howard, who died trying to save others. Howard's mother had pressed it into his hand. It became his personal reminder of the lives lost and the task that lay ahead. The task was war. On September 20th, he addressed a joint session of Congress. He identified the enemy, a radical network of Islamic extremists, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. Their home base was Afghanistan, where they were sheltered by the brutal Taliban regime. He delivered an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over the terrorists, or you will share in their fate. When the Taliban refused, the decision was made. On October 7, 2001, from the treaty room in the White House, he announced that American military strikes had begun in Afghanistan. The war on terror had entered a new phase. The initial campaign in Afghanistan was swift and successful. Working with local Afghan fighters known as the Northern Alliance, and supported by overwhelming American air power and small teams of special forces, the coalition routed the Taliban. By December, the Taliban regime had fallen, and Al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed. But a new, more complex challenge began: building a stable, democratic Afghanistan that would never again become a safe haven for terrorists. This was the ultimate nation-building mission. It was a moral obligation, he believed, but also a strategic necessity. A free Afghanistan would be a powerful alternative to the extremist ideology of the terrorists. The second major front in the war on terror was Iraq. For Bush, the logic connecting Iraq to the post-9/11 world was straightforward. After the attacks, he couldn't look at a threat like Saddam Hussein the same way. Here was a dictator who had invaded his neighbors, used chemical weapons on his own people, harbored terrorists, and for a decade had defied United Nations resolutions demanding he prove he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction. In a world where terrorists could turn airplanes into missiles, the risk of a tyrant like Saddam sharing WMD with a terrorist group was, in Bush's mind, a risk America could not afford to take. He called it the doctrine of preemption, confronting threats before they could fully materialize. He embarked on a path of what he called coercive diplomacy. He went to the United Nations in September 2002 and challenged the institution to enforce its own resolutions. The Security Council responded, passing Resolution 1441 unanimously, which gave Saddam a final opportunity to disarm or face serious consequences. Weapons inspectors returned to Iraq, but Saddam continued his game of deception and delay. In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell delivered a powerful presentation to the UN, laying out the intelligence case against Saddam. At the time, intelligence agencies around the world believed Saddam had WMD. But diplomacy failed. Saddam refused to comply. In March 2003, after giving Saddam and his sons 48 hours to leave Iraq, Bush made the decision to use military force. On March 19, Operation Iraqi Freedom began. The initial invasion was another stunning military success. In just 3 weeks, coalition forces swept through Iraq and toppled Saddam's regime. The scenes of Iraqis celebrating in the streets and pulling down a statue of their former dictator were powerful. In May, Bush landed on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and declared that major combat operations in Iraq had ended. But the war was far from over. What followed was a long, brutal, and costly insurgency. The transition from dictatorship to democracy proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The decision to disband the Iraqi army left thousands of armed, unemployed men on the streets, many of whom joined the insurgency. And Iraq became a magnet for foreign terrorists, including a brutal al-Qaeda affiliate led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The violence escalated. By 2006, Iraq was descending into a bloody sectarian civil war. Car bombs, kidnappings, and executions became daily occurrences. American casualties mounted. The war became deeply unpopular at home. Many, including some in his own party, were calling for a withdrawal. Bush writes that this was the darkest period of his presidency. For the first time, he worried they might not succeed. He knew that defeat in Iraq would be catastrophic, a victory for al-Qaeda, a destabilized Middle East, and a devastating blow to American credibility. He refused to accept that outcome. He had always told his commanders to give him their best military advice, not what they thought he wanted to hear. But by late 2006, he felt the strategy wasn't working. He initiated a top-to-bottom review of his entire Iraq policy. He challenged every assumption. He brought in outside experts. He listened to dissenting voices. The result was his final, most controversial, and perhaps most courageous decision of the war: the surge. In January 2007, against the advice of many military leaders and in the face of overwhelming political opposition, he announced he was sending more than 20,000 additional American troops into Iraq. But it wasn't just about more troops. It was a completely new strategy. Instead of operating from large, secure bases, American forces would live and patrol among the Iraqi people, clearing neighborhoods of insurgents and then holding them, providing the security needed for political and economic life to return. He put a new commander in charge, General David Petraeus, the architect of the new counterinsurgency strategy. It was a massive gamble. If it failed, his presidency would be defined by it. The surge was incredibly difficult. The fighting was intense, and American casualties initially rose. But slowly, methodically, it began to work. Security improved dramatically. Sectarian violence plummeted. And in the Sunni heartland of Anbar province, local tribes who had once fought alongside the insurgents rose up and turned against al-Qaeda. This Anbar awakening was a turning point. By the end of his presidency, Iraq was a transformed country. It was a functioning, multi-ethnic democracy. Violence was at its lowest levels since the war began. And Iraqi forces were increasingly taking the lead in securing their own country. The surge had succeeded. Beyond the wars, Bush also faced two of the greatest domestic crises of a generation. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a storm of historic power, slammed into the Gulf Coast, breaching the levees of New Orleans and flooding 80% of the city. The response, he admits, was a failure at all levels of government: federal, state, and local. He was criticized for appearing detached in the initial days of the storm. He writes that this criticism was fair. He should have gone to the disaster zone sooner. His biggest mistake, he believes, was not sending in federal troops immediately to restore order, even without the governor's request. The chaos in New Orleans became a symbol of government incompetence, and it was a deep stain on his presidency. The final crisis was the financial meltdown of 2008. The origins of the crisis were complex, rooted in years of risky lending practices, a housing bubble, and a lack of proper regulation. In September 2008, the system imploded. The investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed, triggering a panic that froze credit markets around the world. It was the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. Bush, a committed free market capitalist, was faced with an agonizing choice. He could let the market correct itself, which his advisors warned could lead to a complete collapse of the global financial system. Or, he could authorize an unprecedented government intervention to save it. He chose to intervene. "I decided to abandon the free market in order to save the free market," he writes. He authorized the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, a $700 billion fund to inject capital into struggling banks and stabilize the system. He also approved emergency loans to the American auto industry to prevent its collapse. These were decisions he loathed, but he believed they were necessary to prevent a second Great Depression. He knew they would be unpopular, but his job wasn't to be popular, it was to protect the country. On his last day in office, he walked into the Oval Office for the final time. On the resolute desk, he left a handwritten note for his successor, Barack Obama. It was a tradition, one president wishing the next well. He wrote, "There will be trying moments. The critics will rage. Your friends will disappoint you. But you will have an almighty God to comfort you, a family who loves you, and a country that is pulling for you, including me." It was a final act of leadership, a peaceful transfer of power that he saw as one of the great strengths of the democracy he had spent 8 years defending. Commentary. Reading Decision Points is a fascinating, and at times, deeply uncomfortable experience. It forces you to step out of the familiar world of headlines and political debates, and into the stark reality of the Oval Office. What becomes clear is that the presidency is not a job of easy choices. The easy decisions never reach the president's desk. The only ones that do are the tough calls, as he puts it, the ones with strong arguments on both sides and no certain outcomes. What's most powerful about this book isn't the justification for the decisions themselves. You may agree with them or you may not. The real power lies in its exploration of how a leader thinks. Bush presents a clear model for decision-making. First, clarify your principles. What do you believe at your core? For him, it was a belief in freedom, personal responsibility, and the sanctity of life. These principles became his compass. Second, seek out all sides of an issue. He describes a process of constantly questioning his advisors, bringing in outside experts, and even reading novels like Brave New World to frame the ethical dimensions of a choice like stem cell research. Third, make a decision and stick with it. He argues that a leader who wavers in the face of criticism projects weakness and creates uncertainty. And finally, accept the consequences. In the presidency, he says, there are no do-overs. This framework is a powerful lesson for anyone, especially someone just starting out in life. At 17, you're facing your own set of decision points. What college to go to? What career to pursue? What kind of person do you want to be? These choices can feel overwhelming. Bush's story offers a guide. It suggests that the best way to navigate these moments is to first understand what you truly believe. Your principles are your anchor. When you know what your core values are, the difficult choices become clearer. The book is also a profound meditation on failure and resilience. He doesn't shy away from his mistakes. He's candid about the failures in the response to Katrina, the flawed intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the political cost of not disclosing his DUI earlier in his career. He owns them. But what he shows, time and again, is that failure isn't the end of the story. His loss in his first run for Congress taught him a lesson that helped him win the governorship. The initial failure of the Iraq strategy led him to the surge, one of the most successful military turnarounds in modern history. The lesson here is a vital one. Resilience isn't about avoiding failure, it's about learning from it. It's about having the humility to admit when you're wrong and the courage to change course. So, what can you take away from all this? I think there are 2 simple but profound actions you can start with today. First, take some time to think about your own principles. What are the non-negotiable values that will guide your life? Write them down. When you face a tough choice, look at that list. It will be your compass. Second, embrace the idea of owning your decisions. When you make a choice, good or bad, take responsibility for the outcome. Don't blame others. Learn from it, and move forward. That is the essence of character, And as this book makes clear, character is the foundation of leadership, whether you're leading a country or simply leading your own life. That was the summary of Decision Points by George W. Bush. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found in the journey of reading the book yourself. It's in the small details, the personal anecdotes, and the quiet moments of reflection that the true weight of these decisions comes alive. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today, the weight of leadership, the courage to change, or the power of principle, has resonated with you, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about leadership and the choices that shape a life. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, and I hope you did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these journeys are worth taking, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep growing together.